All right, it's 12:04. I think we're going to get the ball rolling. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Got some people to thank and some things to say up front. This is great to see it all, and it's great to have it up. This is a huge effort each year. I want to thank first, state first, that this is supported by the Robert B. Church III Memorial Lecture Fund, as all our events are, among other funders along the way, but that's the major one. And college supports this very well, both structurally, institutionally, but also in terms of the content and spirit of what we like to get up to. The Dean Young is in constant support of what we're doing, and we're thankful for that all the time. And the committee, which involves Julie and I, but also Scotty McDaniel and Chris Coate, who are, I believe, here somewhere. There's a lot of work behind the scenes from all four of those people, and it leads to moments like this, which we're really happy and proud of. Also we want to thank the Ewing Gallery for having us here in general, but also being very generous about this event, which is more or less rare for what we do in here, but also exhibits in here in general. So thanks to Eric and Sarah, the staff who work here, but also Julie, the director of the gallery. Thanks so much for having us in this space, and each and every fall. There's a staff people behind the scene too that facilitate all this kind of stuff. Brock Hertel is on our team now. Thanks, we're really happy about that. Setting things up behind the scenes, and then Lindsay McBee, who wrangles everything communications wise, and the OIT guys. Thank you so much. The students helped us set this thing up. Some students were labored on behalf of this show: Parker, Ella, Taylor, Cole, Emily Sue. There may be others in there, but those are the ones that we thought of most, that we remembered. Yeah. And then, so that does it for the thanks. Thank you to all of you for being here, of course. And I just want to describe the content of the show a little bit. We're joined today by three guests. We've struggled this morning to describe them, whether as authors or prompters or artists or creatives, and we put a lot of qualifications on that. But first is Curry Hackett. Many of you, most of you, maybe all of you know Curry Hackett from his time here at UT and elsewhere. Curry's joining us today from Harvard, where he's making his home these days. Shelby Doyle, joining us from Iowa State University, and her other creative endeavors. And Andrew Cudless, joining us from University of Houston. These people, Julie and I tried to set up the show as an investigation or reflection on the use of generative AI tools in creative practices these days, which is there's no shortage of them, right? Like, it's easy to see that happening, that engine churning in the world of creative design these days. But it was increasingly difficult for us to find people using it rigorously and intentionally, and in ways that challenge the kind of background, socio-political questions, existential questions about what it means to be a designer, an image maker, and what these tools both offer us, but also should make us critically concerned, if you will. And our three guests are exemplary in that sense. We really admired their work, just what we've seen online. Each of them also has a thriving creative practice that is not related to AI, of course. And it's really interesting to have this show, the content of this show, be their investigations with generative AI tools, which is kind of unique. We've been reflecting on that this morning as well. Haven't seen an exhibit like this one, and haven't seen this many images at one time, if you will. So scrolling through social media feeds is not quite the sensation that I'm getting in the room among all these images. Also, want to carefully reflect on the content submitted by you all. So we did an open call as well for generative AI images used in the context of creative work here in the college. And want to thank deeply everyone who submitted to that and everyone who participated in that. It was really, really awesome, actually, to kind of see all the images and to just kind of get a sense of what's going on with people's imaginations relative to these things in our very school. So thank you to everyone who put in the labor and to taking a risk, let's say, and we're happy and proud to have your work here among this conversation. Does that do it? Okay. Thanks so much. I'm going to turn over the conversation to Julie.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. So just to get things rolling, I'd say when you take a look throughout the gallery, you'll notice that some of the themes that people are exploring are a little bit more meta about the technical side of this tool, kind of tinkering with it, trying to really hack it, understand how the tool works and what the nature of AI is. And then others you'd find are a little bit more thematic with their interests. It's a little bit more political, social, cultural. And AI is simply a means to getting there, but it's really not about AI itself. In some ways, it just allows us to imagine things more vividly than you might have expected or been able to do manually without the help of these tools. So I'd love if each of our contributors could speak to where their affinities lie on the spectrum. If their interests are more about the technical side, really hacking and understanding the tool, or if it goes more thematically. Who would like to begin?
It'll be me. I guess it'll be me. Yeah, so I think, my work is over here. And for me, it's certainly been a thematic, I should say it started off as a kind of thematic exercise, just trying to use this tool that allows you to create a lot of images very quickly, but also allows me to take ideas in my mind and kind of make them more material. For me, that's been, it started off just me just trying to think through what aspects of, let's say, my lived experience, my upbringing in the rural South might be relevant to a kind of architectural canon. So what would it mean for a quilt, for instance, to become or be recast as an architectural material? And what can be learned not only just from doing that, but like how can maybe the architecture discipline be reshaped by thinking differently about materiality and creating shorter distances between maybe body and building. That being said, I think because of the nature of this work, I'm obviously drawing from a Black kind of context. It is still, I'm still having to grapple with certain limitations that the tool Midjourney in this case has, that are sort of intrinsic to how it works. I've found that the moderation tools that, for instance, prevent you from making lewd images or overtly racist images. That moderation is also AI powered. And so it's not incredibly nuanced in what it does and doesn't allow you to create. So for instance, when I was trying to make a set of images of Black folks enjoying watermelon in the middle of the street, it flagged it as being racist, which I thought was the height of irony. And so there's, while it started off as a thematic exercise, this technology is not purely deterministic, right? It's not just, I get this thing, I put this thing in and then I get out an exact repeatable result. A lot of it is me trying to sneak through certain, frankly, problematic defaults and biases that Midjourney has for Black people in this case. Or even Black women. So that has been kind of the technical side, or the technical maybe opportunities have kind of snuck into a kind of way of working that I think is ultimately generative, but it's starting to, it's not purely an aesthetic exercise anymore. I think it's starting to become something a little different.
So for me, this work started as part of an archival project I was doing at the Canadian Centre for Architecture in a research group called the Digital Now Architecture and Intersectionality. And I don't know if you all have read much about intersectionality, but the very short version is it's a term that Kimberly Crenshaw introduced in the late 80s, early 90s, looking specifically at intersections of race and gender and Black women in their relation to real estate and being able to purchase real estate. And it has since expanded into a larger discourse that thinks about ways in which intersections might amplify or exacerbate forms of inequality. And so when I began this project, I was looking to see if there was a way to look at an archive intersectionally. Like, is that a method that's available? And I was specifically looking at the archaeology of the digital, which was an exhibition and a book curated by Greg Lynn in the late, between, I think it was 2008 and 2013, but so relatively recently, looking at sort of the foundation of computational practices in architecture. And that exhibition and that book sort of presented that archaeology, and you can think about the other problematics of the term archaeology and kind of empire and like bounding knowledge, and there was only one woman represented in the book. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to go to the archive and I'm going to find all these other people and these stories that weren't told because of curatorial agendas. And instead I found a lot of absence. And so that really to me was a question of like, what do we archive? How do we archive? What are the politics and power relations of archive? But that goes into present-day pedagogies and the ways that we think about architecture and what we make legible, because it talks about value. It talks about the value of forms of knowledge. And so I started going to Midjourney and querying things out of kind of a frustration. And you'll notice that the images are very, very, very pink. And that's because the tags that are associated with feminism were pink. So when you label things and you start to create these large data sets around people or ideas, you end up with these correlations which are not necessarily productive. And so I find the pink a little bit like enraging rather than as a positive. But about this idea that why is it that if you call up, so all these prompts, I'm not playing with like the tool as much. I'm just saying like if you mine what's out there in the Midjourney model and you ask it to imagine digital feminist architecture, history, computation, this is part of what you get back. And so, you know, that we're both like relying upon labeled data that categorizes information and knowledge in problematic ways, but also that it's recreating itself through that labeling. So now all of these images share the same labels of those that, and you know, you can sit with them and like there's these lone images and like these lone people and like why do they have their back to the camera? Like why are they wearing these weird handmade tail gowns? Like there's just a lot of things that I wish I could sort of ask the archive and the sort of images that are created that are still very inaccessible despite sort of I think there's some sort of hope of AI creating some sort of transparency maybe, and that this feels very untransparent in some way. But
so I think this idea of the technical and the thematic, I'd say that my work, it's probably my theme is the technical in a way. I'm trying to understand how I can use this productively in my own practice and what are the limits technically and what are the opportunities to push things beyond some of the limits, or what the kind of planned or the designed kind of use cases are for this. How do I work around those? So I'd say like maybe the images that are on kind of or behind us on the wall there and hanging behind Shelby's head, that the theme was more, for me as a designer, how do I use this tool as a form of sketching? How do I work out an idea kind of iteratively with that? And I wasn't really diving into the biases of the model or anything like that. It was really just how do I use this productively, and what are the limitations of that and what are the opportunities? And for me, the opportunity was that I had always resisted kind of modeling and designing with fabrics, despite a deep affinity for it. It was just the difficulty of simulating that in the computer and rendering it and all that was just like I just wasn't interested in that kind of form of labor, and being able to use a tool that doesn't really, there's no computational difference between trying to make an image of something that is covered in fabric or something that's concrete, that it's not looking at the rendering in that way, and I was just interested on a technical level what that meant for me as a designer. And then for like the images on this wall, kind of up right there, and over on the wall here, I'd say those maybe were more interested in the combination of the technical, of like some of the, what I think most people, specifically the programmers, when I've talked to the programmers of Stable Diffusion, they've said, oh yeah, this is a bug, don't do that. And I didn't realize it was a bug at first. I thought it was really interesting. But it's if you try producing something at a resolution higher than what the model has been trained on, it starts repeating itself, almost like stuttering in a way. And so like any small part of that image makes sense, but because it's much larger resolution than 1024 by 1024, it repeats itself. And as it repeats itself, it produces these, it accentuates, I'd say, some of the biases of the model. So in that image, I think the prompt was a street in New York. And the one kind of hanging behind us is a street in Delhi. And you can see like there's the street in New York, although kind of glitchy and weird in a lot of ways, it feels comfortable as an image of New York, whereas the image of Delhi feels like it's made of rags and garbage and things like that. And there's a clear kind of bias towards, and when you look at all of the images on the wall, that it kind of renders, it understands kind of Western cities in a more benign way, and non-Western cities, it's always looking at them from a very Western lens. And it's due to the just sheer quantity of images or lack of images for certain cities. Yeah, and then the third set of images that are kind of, you can see it on this wall here, the field atlas images. I also on a kind of technical level, but also as a designer, I felt like how could I gain more control over the images, not just, like I tend to be, I can use images to describe my work better than I can use words. I think a lot of us went into architecture and design because we're visual thinkers. And I think a lot of us have struggled with like, how do we write a prompt properly to get what we want? And there's a lot of frustration with that. So looking at how to use diagrams that I could either draw, or I could draw digitally or draw by hand, and how I could use those to push the model in a certain direction.
Yeah, thanks all. I should mention quickly that if you have questions ever, please ask, and I'm happy to run this out and let's make this more of a conversation. So just flag me down. But this exchange or series there was pretty interesting insofar as cultivating a relationship with the tool, how to, what is your disposition towards the tool? I mean, in some cases you're describing it as a friend, and that was a metaphor that came up earlier with Andrew, like you described it as a friend sitting next to you, bouncing ideas off the friend, and that friend helps you. I do that with ChatGPT too, in my, when I have an anxiety attack, I'll go to it and ask it what to do sometimes. But then, when Shelby describes your work, it's more like there's a kind of embedded antagonism, it's almost like it's producing things that make you angry. And I don't know about Curry, I'm not sure what your disposition is towards the tool, or if it's feeding you things ever that you're like, this is my friend, or this is my foe, or this is just like a medium I'm working through. Yeah.
Just to add to that question, I'm really curious, if you are enjoying using AI, or where you find joy in the process. I think that Andrew found joy in the glitch, right? It was like, oh, that was weird, let me keep going with it, and kind of going to the extreme, versus you were talking about frustrations of not being able to get the outputs you were looking for and having to work around it. But I'm curious, where you are actually really loving this process, and where you're maybe less friendly towards it.
Yeah, maybe calling it a friend is too friendly. Frenemy, maybe, is better in that. I think my biggest frustration is, but it can also be useful at times, is that you put something in, you have an idea in your head about what the prompt is going to generate, and then it produces something that is completely different than what you wanted, and often the thing that it's generated conforms to a lot of biases and conventional ways of thinking about what you wrote, and you weren't thinking about that when you wrote that. So it's like reinterpreting your meaning and pushing it in the wrong direction, right? And so that's always the frustration for me, that it makes it look like it came out of, Dwell magazine or something, and I'm just like, that's not what I was aiming for. I was trying to do something else. So I think what I've realized, though, is that a lot of software is like that, right? Like if you don't know Revit really well, if you don't know Rhino really well, it's going to produce really conventional things, right? So all softwares have kind of an internal bias in them of like they're selling a product, right? And in order to sell that product, they need to market it towards the average consumer. Towards the glitch in a way. I'm fascinated with how to kind of misuse the software to make it do something that I want to do and not what Midjourney wants it to do, or Autodesk or Adobe or whatever software I'm using.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was trying to think if I thought this was a good tool or not. I think, okay, so I started this project really in 2017. I co-wrote a paper around a term that we made up called computational feminism. And that came out of this, to this point of friend or foe, that technology had been, and like the spaces of technology and architecture for me had been very gendered, in the sense that I'd go to tech conferences and I would see 5 white men present a panel, and I kept sort of waiting for it to get better. And it was always sort of the promise that like, it's getting better, like next year it'll be fine, it'll be okay. And it just wasn't, and then as I started to teach and starting to develop my own, pedagogy and trying to like write better bibliographies and sort of more inclusive histories, that absence kept sort of showing up again. And so what did it mean to kind of go out and try to stake this claim? And the sort of idea that these tools were ever neutral, or that they could ever be presented neutrally as the problem, and that somehow tech as like this big impenetrable thing had like gotten off the hook, because it was like, oh well, it's just a tech conference, like we're talking about technology, like all of these other issues of race and class and gender and indigeneity are extra disciplinary, they're not about technology. And so like trying to find ways to talk about that where, even the existence of this like kind of insidious pink thing 10 years ago in my career was an impossibility in a lot of ways. And I think what's fascinating about these images, and be they Curry's or Andrew's or mine, is the reaction and the range of reactions you get. Because if I talk about computational feminism, there are some people who are so effing mad that word has infiltrated their safe tech space. And then other people who are like, well, even the term feminism is exclusionary because it relies on this history of binary. And then also to talk to anyone who's not an architect, and you're like, well, actually Black feminists got to this like 50 years ago and we just weren't listening. And so that architecture in many ways is very late to some of these conversations and has a very poor set of ways to grapple with or even make visible some of these conversations. And so like I see this as like smuggling in all this other stuff through like something that's sort of presented as like weirdly benign, and that like even I don't know if you guys have spent much time in Discord or on Midjourney chats, but it is a weird place. And it is still like very much like in the tradition of like video games and hypersexualized women. Like I didn't even know that you could take like a sexualized woman and put that together with like how many prompts you can even like bring together to do that. And that even like being in that space, despite all of the like pseudo protections of like not being able to do things that are like too sexual, it's still really weird and uncomfortable. And if I'm going to ask my students to go use a tool that's going to expose them to all of this, like what does that mean as like a teacher? So I think that's where my confrontation with this comes from, is that these are not spaces that make it easy to have conversations or to exist outside of some sort of very specific way of engaging with them.
No, I think that's right. I think when I first started using Midjourney and started creating this work, I think I quickly realized that terms that were familiar to me, Midjourney has no understanding of. Well, I don't think it has any relationship to the truth or to reality, which I think is really what creates those frictions that I think we're talking about. That that when I try to make a watermelon joyous scene, I just can't fathom that that black and watermelon in the same prompt could lead to a positive outcome. I don't know what other things I could have put into. I think I ended up getting it to work. I think I switched out black for African American and like watermelon for melon or something funny like that, and it was like, oh, cool, yeah, we can do it. But I think for me, this tool has been really useful in that the outcome, the image just as an image, I think there's a lot of power in just putting the thing out in the world and just seeing how people react to it. It's also just really validating of the things that I'm imagining that are rooted in a kind of rural Southern Black context. And then finding joy and invention and ingenuity and agency and abundance, like being able to map that as an image or render that vision as an image, to me has been, I think, the most valuable outcome of this tool. That being said, it's ultimately me bringing my subjectivity to this tool that has no relationship to a subjectivity. So, in that point, it's like, who's doing what? And then it becomes, is the tool actually acting? Is the tool just a means to an end? I think technology in general, though, the way that I've been using this technology and even how technology has been talked about in recent years, kind of what Shelby is getting at. Like, I feel like this work is ultimately just part of an existing tradition or a long tradition of Black folks kind of apparently misusing mainstream technology. I'm just looking no further than the turntable and how Black folks in the Bronx just made it into a completely different instrument and genre. That now undergirds most of pop music, right? So I think it'll be interesting to see how folks that have been historically marginalized and are already familiar and comfortable with difference, and are comfortable with having to push through things to make new things. What does it mean for a kind of emergent population to import a spirit of making do into a technology like this? So I think there's interesting and provocative and maybe good or fun things that can come out of this technology, not because of, but maybe in spite of the limitations and biases that are baked into them.
So I just want to carry on this comment you made about the technology hasn't really changed that much, or that you're still kind of working in a similar manner, even though you've now taken on AI. And I'm curious for each of you how much engaging this tool that basically became prolific in the last year has been a detour for you from your other research trajectories, how much it's kind of stimulated you to think about new subjects, or on the other side of this, how it's really just a continuation of your interests, as all of you have your own practices that are not AI related.
Does that work? Okay, great. Yeah, I think for me, it's, I've just been thinking of this tool as one of many tools that I use. I think it's a danger to like treat these images, especially in the context of like commercial work or scholastic work, as the finished outcome. I think they have to be. I think of this as a kind of feedback loop, because and putting it in context with research interests that I already have. So, thinking about Black kinship, the relevance of like Black kinship models, materials like kudzu and red clay that kind of epitomize the Black, I should say, the Southern landscape. For me, it's interesting to. I was already thinking about how to find relevance for those sort of materials to my practice. So this just feels like another way of getting there. That being said, it's been fun to kind of cross-pollinate this tool with things that I was already using, namely collage. Anyone that's in here that took my class probably knows that that's my jam, is collage. Not only as an outcome and as a medium, but also as a way of thinking and a way of teaching. A kind of attitude of putting things that don't seem like they don't belong together in context with each other. So for me, it's the only thing that it is kind of derailed or detoured is it's forced me to think maybe more in a more speculative way than maybe I would have otherwise. But because they're photorealistic, it's also, I'm like, how can some of these things be real? And so that maybe puts me, I'm starting to think more architecturally than maybe I was before this work. Another thing that I've been thinking about is the subjects that, so it's not just materials that show up in these images. I try to, as much as I can, try to incorporate or render the labor that is making these things, these worlds possible. So that's why, in the quilting ones in particular, I'm always trying to create images of mostly Black women that are actually like, what would it mean for them to be on scaffolding, like cladding buildings with quilts. And so that gets me to, how would our practice be different if quilters were collaborating with civil engineers or like planners, and like what does it mean to kind of recast urban conditions as inclusive of disciplines that we don't traditionally think of as architects or builders. So that for me is like a really fascinating kind of expansion, I think, of how I've already been maybe thinking about the relevance of culture to architecture. So that's kind of how I've been. That's how I've been kind of wrestling with this technology. But at the end of the day, I think of this tool. I've described this tool as like a 2-year-old, extremely artistic 2-year-old. That where English is like its 7th language. And so like it's kind of also forced me to be critical and discerning about the terms that I use to describe not only architecture but maybe Blackness. And so that's also been, like, it's affected a lot, I think, in terms of how I write, how I draw, how I practice. So anyway.
I don't know how to follow that up, Curry. I feel like we should just end there. I'd already been trying to find ways to talk about these terms that, if I Googled computational feminism or computational labor, computational intersectionality, there wasn't like this robust answer that, the internet gave back to me, which, I probably shouldn't have been surprised. And this conversation around AI and archive, there's a video over here that's part of the other parts of the work of like these cast electronic objects, and it kind of talks about some of the other externalities of this, of data labeling and data categorization and the logics of that, and then the kind of environmental costs of all of the work that we're doing. That, this question of maybe making labor faster for us, but sort of at what cost? Like, what other outcomes are there if someone's getting paid 50 cents an hour to label the images that Midjourney relies upon, or ChatGPT, or all of the sort of different things that we're using? And these aren't new questions, but I do think there is certainly a lot of things that are made invisible. And I think it changed some of my work in the sense that we all got kicked out of our labs during COVID. And, you know, there was a moment where, you know, you're trying to figure out, what do you do if you can't make stuff, or at least the way that I usually made stuff. And also I'm usually like carrying really heavy things and like dealing with material and mess. And there was sort of something nice about stepping away from that for a second and being like, is there another way to approach this question of computational labor? Like, what does it mean? And how quickly it becomes sort of gobbled up under like GoPro videos and like kind of these drawings that look very sort of, there's like no friction to them in some ways, where they actually do represent a huge sort of infrastructure that makes all of this possible. And so in many ways, these are like sort of windows or proxies for other conversations rather than like the end point of that. And so I want to hear more from all of you, because I'm curious to see, like, before you heard us, like how you responded to the work, or if you read it in very different ways. So
I think for me, the major difference between the work that I'm doing with AI and the rest of my work was that both as an educator and as a designer, a lot of my work was focusing on, I'd say, like fairly steep learning curves, like technologies that require pretty steep learning curves, like Grasshopper and coding and things like that. And I think the way that informed my own way of working was that I was beginning to sketch kind of less, and I was kind of always maybe I was sketching with Grasshopper or sketching with code, but it was still felt like a very kind of rational and technical approach towards the design of something. Like, it was immediately getting into dimensions of things. Even if it was a slider, it was still like being very precise with how things were connected and all of that. And I think with AI, both for my students and for me, I feel there's like it brings back sketching in a really freeing way, and it brings back, like, I don't have to worry immediately about, like, what's the component that I need to put there in order to do this, and what's the next step, and things like that. I can just get an idea while I'm waiting in line at the grocery store and type something in, and I'm like, okay, that's not quite right, but I'll come back to this, when I'm falling asleep at night. Like, there's another way that I can access a different part of my brain, I feel like, when I'm using these tools, that I'm not immediately jumping in to, even if my work is maybe more on the technical end, I feel like, personally, I'm not using that part of my brain as much as I am that I can sketch with this very freely.
Hands went up.
Wow. That was a lot of hands at once. James was first.
Okay. So this has been pretty fantastic so far. So I would just like to ask, as a bit of a meta question for the teachers in the room even, what's your attitude about using this in teaching, and when would you introduce this in teaching? Do you think it's a new baseline skill that everyone should be exposed to immediately, or is it for upper level students?
So I'm teaching a workshop for freshman students on Wednesday in not just my studio, but for the 240 students in the whole freshman class of interior architecture, and industrial design students. And I'll be showing specifically the image of the forest city that's on the other side of the wall there, like how to use diagrams that you sketch to generate an image very quickly. Because I think one of the biggest problems, I was alluding to this a moment ago, that one of the biggest problems I have as an educator is that when I was a student, there were skills that you had to learn, like you had to learn how to draw and you had to learn how to physically model, but you could pick up how to draw pretty quickly. Maybe you weren't very fast at it, but there wasn't like a manual, let's say, that was like a Grasshopper manual for how to draw. Like you could pick up drawing, you could pick up how to glue basswood together. It's pretty easy. There's a very shallow learning curve. Learning how to use Revit or learning how to use Grasshopper, Rhino, Photoshop, these all have pretty steep learning curves. And so for upper level students, they've reached that peak, right? And they can produce with the work. But with freshman students, they have a lot of ideas, but they don't have a lot of the skills yet on how to work through those ideas. So what I'm trying to do with this, these freshman students is like, how do I empower them with these skills where they can just sketch something really quickly, and then they already know, how to write. So it's already a skill that they can bring to the table. And then we can talk about some of the biases, some of the challenges of using this software, but it's a much shallower learning curve, and I think it empowers them in a way that, eventually they'll have some of the other skills they need as a designer, but it just takes a long time, and I feel very, kind of empathetic for them, like where I see a student have a great idea, and they just don't know how to represent that idea yet. So I want to find tools that help them do that don't involve weeks and weeks of Grasshopper tutorials and other things.
Are there more questions?
Oh. We can go to questions.
Pass it around.
All right. You're next. I just go right here too.
Ella was next. Ella was next.
So I have a question more for Shelby and about your maybe frustration with the pink a little. And I was just wondering, did you ever try and kind of hack the system to kind of get it where it wouldn't pre-impose the pink, or did you feel that it would be sort of counterintuitive to your research into using the tool to produce these images?
Yeah, there was a moment where I was like, okay, I'm gonna unpink these, and I'm gonna but I think why it continued is that's what kept coming back, and that sort of point that, and to the point of how you teach these things and whether you teach them, that's something that I think we actually have to do more of, is to say this is not actually a technical project, it's a humanities project. And there's been such a push to take all sorts of knowledge and define it as STEM. What does it mean to look at an image and say, I've called this up to tell me about a feminist history of computation, and it brought me back a woman in a dress that's pink? That's the project that we have to do more work on. Anyone can send the prompt, and so I think for me, walking into a space that was filled with pink images that used the words architecture and computation in the same sentence was it was a little bit fun, even though it's very problematic, because that wasn't even necessarily a possibility in my work or in my the spaces of computation. So it was a little tongue-in-cheek too. But I think to these kind of questions of teaching, we were just talking about some of the software now that you use embeds all the kind of metadata of its creation. And I think there's this real promise, for better or for worse, when you start a deep citational practice of where everything comes from. And I don't know if you guys have ever read Dear Science, McKittrick, and the kind of idea of capacious citation and the way that it kind of allows us to celebrate collectivity in ways that we don't typically within the academy. We reward very specific ideas, and by the academy I mean the university students, faculty. We reward people for individual output and sort of a genius. And if there's a way to do a better job as designers in showing that these things aren't made alone, that we don't practice alone, buildings aren't built alone, ideas aren't made alone, and that if the technology can actually help us reveal collective practice and collective labor, then I think that's where we have to do the work as teachers, to say if you do use ChatGPT, what does that mean? How many people just contributed to your work? How many software engineers, who built the hardware? How many people labeled the data? What sort of weird Reddit forum was this pulled from? And then also that you have to way to validate the knowledge. And for a long time, we've used citational practices to do that. But if you're not going to rely on traditional citation, how do you all of a sudden decide something's truth in any sort of mechanism? And what role does the university have? Which I think is a very big problem right now. What truths get told and how are they validated is not something that's just an educational issue. It's a civic, societal issue.
Yeah, I'll just add a note on the teaching as well. I think what Shelby's hitting on is like I think we have to think really radically differently about the kind of container, not only of architecture school, but or the architecture discipline, but architecture school, design education. I love the idea of it being like a kind of humanities thing. I mean, even if you look at like current day AI like job descriptions, a lot of times folks are asking for PhDs and with specialties in things like heuristics and language, right? So and neuroscience, right? And so it seems to be that even STEM, engineering, AI is already kind of being somewhat more comfortable, I think, in being transdisciplinary. And so I wonder what that means for educators as well as students to think really radically outside of what they think is architecture and what they think is relevant to building. What does it mean to invite the G's Bend quilters from rural Alabama into the conversation about what is architectural, right? I think there's a lot to be learned there in shaping classroom dynamics. I think there's a lot to be learned there in shaping who we think the client is, who we think the public is. These all are imperatives that I think students are thinking about when they're creating their work, but they're also things that I think that the educators are thinking through when we write the syllabi. So the quilting for me looms large in my imagination, not only as like a fabric that brings warmth and care, but I have been thinking a lot through for instance, like what does it mean to kind of quiltify architecture, which is to say, like, what would it mean for architecture to be soft and to be warm, and to invite maintenance that is socially performed, right? So I think there's a potential for, if we can get past some of the hard skills that we felt like we needed to have to get to generate an image, then maybe there opens up some mental real estate for us to engage with other disciplines, other forms of making, other forms of writing. So.
Okay, Carl.
I claimed the mic. Sorry. It is quite a privilege to have you three here. I might be biased, but you three are definitely who I cite the most as saying the smartest, most critical and interesting things about AI in a world that is very immature in its discourse, even as the tool is maturing faster than we're comfortable with. There's a lot of positivity here, even in the sense that when AI produces something that generates anger, it's proof that we were right to be angry, right? So it's positivist about the existence of the tool, and what it enables in terms of creativity is being framed in a positive light. And I think that's totally necessary. I'm in the optimistic, subject to an exit strategy camp about all technology and tools for sure. 20, 30 years ago, there was a camp that was very aggressively the counterpoint to digital media in education, right? So some of us were saying, like, in 30 years, we're all going to be using software and much more than that. And we were totally right. But there was a group that was totally wrong, but was productively wrong, and was, enacting acts of refusal, and was starting to carve alternative territories. And looking back, I am glad they existed, because it kind of led to a more hybrid future. It kind of maybe propelled some of our discourse as users / creative people to kind of advance where technology was going. So what's your take on that? Like, do we need to cultivate some more curmudgeons amidst us? Like, do we need that territory where we say, okay, there's a moment where it's before it slips in and becomes mainstream, we need to have territories that are AI exclusive, or some other way to have that aggressive, adversarial, in the most academic sense, counterpoint?
No. What's that? No.
Do you have something?
I was going to say, but there seemed to be another question. No. Oh, yes and no. I mean, in the sense that, like, I think that the curmudgeons, if we're going to call them that, or the whatever the position is, I think the challenge here is to both understand the technology and the critique, and that there's very few people, I think, that are doing that work of using a technology and also critiquing it. It seems like the critique is often external, and everyone loves to throw lobs at technology because it's like the big bad Meta, Google. You know, it's easy. Like you can be mad at like big tech. And I think that like what I hope is that critique is coming from folks who are doing that work. And then also that we admit, and to the point of the pinkness, is like, this is doing things that already are happening. It is just revealing biases and ways of working and things that are insidious in our culture. It's not like this is all new. It's just, it makes things faster and it amplifies them more quickly. So it's like, this is the work that people have been doing on culture for as long as media has existed. So it's kind of like a lot of the tropes and critiques are not actually that interesting, in the sense that like they're basically questions of like what humans value and what they do when they have like a voice of any type, be it like reading, writing, computers. So yeah, I guess if the curmudgeons want a curmudgeon, like they gotta like show up with like a thing. No, and also AI is terrifying. Like, understand that we are like being very positive, but there is so much bad that could also be done with this.
So on that point of the terrifying side, and I just want to talk kind of internally to the AI community. There are these positivists and negative areas. And my big worry as a user of AI and someone interested in the future of it is the open source versus closed source kind of battle that's going on. And it doesn't fall on lines, kind of going back to the big tech, that we're used to in a way. That on one side there's Microsoft and OpenAI and Google and Midjourney, Midjourney being a very, very minor player in all of that, but they're on the proprietary side and saying, this is a very scary technology, which is weird for a company that's producing it, you know, saying like, this is very, very scary, and it's so scary that we should be the only ones that get to make the model, and we'll let you, you know, dabble in it, but we're not going to tell you everything that went into it, right? And that's very scary to me. And on the other side, there's the open source community, which oddly is Meta and Stable Diffusion or Stability AI, and they're saying, yeah, this stuff could be very worrying, and the only thing that we can do to help fight that is to try to have as many people have access to it and be able to change it to make it better, rather than trusting a bunch of white guys in Silicon Valley and Seattle. And I think that's my big worry, is that I don't think we really should trust big tech, and I don't think we should, you know, like OpenAI is, like, there's tons of biases in this, and I think the only way to kind of get rid of them is to make the models cheaper and easier to use and more open source, so that more people can validate it and retrain the models to kind of be more centered on their lived experience rather than, yeah. So it's a little bit different than what you were asking, but I think that's my big worry at the moment.
Yeah, this conversation is reminding me of my undergrad education at Howard, where there was like a small group of us that were like actively learning all the material, all the programs, and like trying to like push our work in certain ways. And then there was the faculty, a large segment of the faculty that were, some of which were very pro BIM. And others were just like very manual drafting, this, that, and the other. And I found that, and this is not just exclusive to HBCU education, I think, but you see this at a lot of other programs, where there is a focus on making sure that the students make the best future employees. And so, like, therefore, we have to manually draft, we have to understand, you know, and that forecloses tools and techniques and exercises, methods of teaching that engender imagination. And often I find that those it's a zero-sum conversation. And my issue, particularly in the HBCU context, is who is it serving to have students just be really good feature employees? And it's particularly insidious because we're the ones that are, presumably best suited to repair and effect change in our own communities. And so I think that being said, a lot of what I'm doing now and how I'm working now is because I had those early couple of years where we were just purely working in analog means of drawing. But I wish that there was the culture of the program was, in hindsight, was set up so that both of those things could be held in context with each other. And so I wonder, to your point, like how there can be conversations that enable nuance, so that it's not just a purely kind of like move fast and break things kind of usage of AI, and just kind of a full unleashing of these tools on our students and then onto our discipline. I wonder, similar to the scenes that are playing out in some of these images, like how do these tools kind of be in a feedback loop or in dialogue with maybe even pre-digital means of making and drawing and building? So.
Oh, I do have this. So Carl may have called me out, but no. No, but I'm going to say I'm a veteran of many panel discussions with new technologies, embrace it or not. But I'm going to, for all three of you, push back on the word, the concept, tool. It's just another tool in the toolbox for, the geniuses to use. And is this AI really a tool? Or is it more like a language? It's an unstable language. It's a language of representation. It's reliant on the language prompt. It seems like a really...
Isn't language a tool?
I was thinking that myself as well. It's a tool that we all use. It has its own kind of conventions. It makes us think differently. So perhaps they're similar in both those ways. But I think that just saying it's another tool in your tool belt is, to me, an insidious... the tools are more powerful than we maybe realize. I'd be interested in your...
I'm just sorry, I'm a little confused on it. So are you saying the tools are more powerful than we realize, but then you're saying that it's more of a language, and that makes it... I guess, can you just maybe repeat your question? Because I don't see what the problem is saying that it's a tool. Like, speaking English is also a tool, or speaking Spanish is a tool, right? It allows us to do things that we wouldn't normally be able to do if we didn't have that ability, right? It's a technology. Language is a technology.
I think it makes us think differently, and we should think profoundly about how it makes us think differently.
I don't think any of us are saying anything different. Any tool that you use, from a pencil to a mouse to the ability to speak or write a certain language, makes your brain think differently.
But it kind of implies you're in charge of the tool when maybe you're not always.
No, there's always a friction, a material resistance, right? Like if you're using a chisel, like, yes, you're partly in control, but also there's material feedback, right? Or if you're speaking to someone, you might think you're in control of what you're saying, but the person receiving that message has a different understanding of some of the words that you're using and the connotations of it. So you're not fully in control of you're in control of what you say, but you're not in control of how it's received. So I think in all cases of using a tool, there's always a resistance and a friction that happens.
Okay, Sarah, let's give you the last.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Wait a minute.
Thanks again for your presentation and your conversation. Earlier on, I heard expressions of hacking and smuggling and working within the constraints of the prompt to then create a counter response or, a critical response and expand the canon. And to me, it makes me think of transgression and discomfort and kind of amplifying that discomfort covertly or overtly. And as a professor, I was just curious, how do you convey that to your students? How do you share that knowledge or that approach with your students? How do you encourage them to embrace a little bit of transgression in their work?
I mean, I think I'm in a state right now in a public institution that has become sort of draconian in its politics. And so this question of transgression and how loudly you're willing to transgress as an educator or as a student is a really powerful one. And so I think those are something here where you're sort of trying to walk that line and that friction of saying, you know, that transgression is powerful. And when you have tools that amplify transgression or amplify also control and oppression and all of these other words that spiral out into much more complicated topics, that I think that in many ways architectural education, and we were going back to this, like, you know, what do you teach? Are you teaching like a set of tools or a way of thinking or a way of approaching? Like, this is like the larger project of pedagogy and knowledge creation. It's not, you know, and architecture is one of many pieces, but that because we can sort of navigate between technology and humanities, and there are many other fields that have that opportunity, that I think that it becomes like really essential to what we do. And I don't have a really good answer to, like, even some of the words that we're using here today, I'm thinking, like, could I have said these in my classroom? You know, and even asking that question is troubling.
Yeah, I think also so much of architecture, at least in the Western tradition, is tries to situate architecture as this neutral, apparently apolitical thing. And we know that's just not right. That's not the case. And so I think, honestly, I could see any of these approaches like being just deployed in the classroom as a way of saying, see, like we told you, and also here's a whole tradition of folks that have been narrating the transgressions that have played out in the built realm, and how architecture has been politicized. I think it's also just worth saying that the making of the images of architecture are also political, and have power and impact. And so I think to me, there seems to be multiple benefits, I think, to putting out using a medium that has biases, that has rough edges, as a way of, like, not only calling out certain limitations of the tool itself, but also showing that it's holding up a mirror to a discipline that bears flaws and certain loyalties to whiteness and other things. So that's how before I went back to grad school, that's how I was teaching even before these tools were more public. Was because I think there's a lot of value in there's a lot of value in showing what harm, I think how architecture can be harmful, and putting that in context with, like, liberatory means of building, or emancipatory means of building. So. Oh, sure.
Okay. In the interest of moving on with our respective worlds and giving our guests a break before they have to keep talking again, deep thanks to you, the trio, Curry, Shelby, Andrew, and Julie, my co-curator. Thanks so much. Thanks for coming.